I plan on making a chess set for my son-in-law, but I want to use green and gold tint for the pieces, and I don't have that. So I'm going to make a practice run at using these molds for a chess set. I'm going to use this red tint. I'm using the Stone Coat casting epoxy. Again, huge thanks to Rob Ryan at Stone Coat for helping me select the right types of epoxies for the jobs that I'm trying to do here. I've measured the pieces here with water to get a sense of the volume, and I think I'm going to be sitting at about 3 ounces. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up 3 ounces of this epoxy, put that red tint on there, and then see what happens. Nothing terribly unexpected on filling in these molds. I am using a lighter to catch the bubbles, and I think that's going to work out okay. I'd rather use a heat gun, but my heat gun is taken up by somebody else. So I misestimated how much epoxy I would need, and to my favor, I accidentally overpoured my resin, and so I had to make more than I expected to make, and that actually turned out to be a good, happy accident, as that got me pretty close to getting almost all of these pieces filled to the top. There's a couple that are just a shy bit short, and I just couldn't fill that in. A couple little minor things that I expected. So the knight right there on his nose, air will get trapped in there as you're doing the pour. So you gotta pour a little bit, then squish that bubble out, and then finish it up. Same thing on the rooks at the bottom, and those I had to kind of work a little bit. But in that, when that mold is making those little divots in the top of the capsule, then that will end up holding air in that mold as well. I used this syringe to put the epoxy into the molds, and I found that was probably pretty decent. You get down towards the end, you end up sucking up a lot of air. So I'm going to try some squeeze bottles if I can find a good source for those, and see if those work a little bit better. I pulled my pieces out of the mold, and I'm really happy with how this test came out. I did have one pawn failure right there, and then I saw this beforehand, but my knight mold is deformed. So I'm going to try that again with a different color, and I'm actually using a clamp to see if I can squeeze that mold and make it a little more circular. If not, then I'm either getting another mold, or I'm just going to use my good knight mold twice. Anyway, I'm really happy with how this came out. Time to do the real run for real pieces. So I'm getting ready for my actual run on the chess pieces. I've got my board leveled. I've got my materials ready to go using the Stone Coat epoxy resin. I'm going to use this emerald green dye from Let's Resin. I also got these fancy little silicone mixing bowls, which I think that's going to work for me a lot better than what I've been using in the past. Two of my molds, also from Let's Resin, they have kind of an oblong shape at the bottom, so I'm using these clamps to try to get them closer to that circular pattern. I could potentially write back to the manufacturer and see if I can get some replacement. I haven't tried that yet, but they might be willing to do that. So what I'm planning on doing is filling these up to about the 3/4 point with the clear epoxy, and then I will make up an epoxy mix with the green, and then put that on the base. And then what I'm hoping is during the curing time that green epoxy blends into the clear, but does not completely mix all the way through. And I think that's going to work pretty good. So let's see what happens. So I'm going to call this pretty much a failure, maybe with some lessons learned. Basically, within this epoxy, hard to see through the mold, I've got a lot of bubbles and I can't get them out. I've looked at all the various YouTube videos, working my way through trying to figure out all the different techniques, and actually none of them have worked. The only thing that I could think about is maybe I get a vacuum pot, put my epoxy in that vacuum pot to pull the bubbles out before I pour it into the mold. Well, my only fear with that is that I'm still going to be agitating the epoxy and giving it an excuse to grab some air bubbles. Could also try to put the mold, once it's got the epoxy in it, into the vacuum chamber. If that's something I can do, I'll do a little bit of research on that. So the problem that I ran into, so normally you would hit this with a heat gun or a lighter, and I tried that on this little thing and it couldn't get the bubbles out, so I sat on it a little bit with the heat gun, and then after just a few seconds it actually started curing the epoxy, and so I had this big hard lump of epoxy. Had to abandon that shot on that mold, and then that makes me very fearful of trying to hit any of these with some heat. So I'm going to hit them with a little bit of heat, let them dry, see how it comes out, but I don't have a lot of hope for this. I ran this epoxy through a vacuum chamber, and while that definitely pulled some bubbles out, it did not get that crystal clear appearance that I see other YouTubers come up with. I decided to go with a little bit different epoxy. Rather than going with the stone coat, I went with the Let's Resin epoxy made for this type of work. I'll be honest with you, the Let's Resin was a lot more difficult to work with as far as getting the bubbles out. Even after running through the vacuum chamber, there was still a lot of bubbles, and I had a hard time trying to get those out of the molds. I think the stone coat epoxy will work better, but I did have problems with pieces breaking as I was getting them out of the mold. So I may need to look at a slightly different type of epoxy from stone coat, or maybe I just need to let them cure in the molds a little bit longer. I did pull them out 2 days after. The dry time for that stone coat epoxy that I was using is 24 hours with a cure time of 7 days. So maybe I just needed to let them sit a little longer. I probably am also stirring this epoxy a little too fast. So the next run that I make, I will stir that a lot slower and see if that gives me any better results. The last run of these were also curing in my garage, and temperatures are getting cooler, so that may have had an impact on how hard the pieces got during the curing process. So now I have these inside the house in my office, hoping that they'll have a more stable temperature and will cure better. Next set of experiments for my chess pieces. Hopefully this is the last. I'm going to mix up some clear epoxy. I'm going to mix up 6 ounces. I'm going to use this stone coat casting epoxy. I'm going to pour about half of that into my molds. And then what I want to do is I want to drop this jade green dye into the epoxy and just see if it diffuses and I get that fading impression that I want to get, and I get that fading look that I want to get. I also want to use the green dye with some black dye and then see if I can mix it in the mold very gently, and then again hopefully that diffuses. Then I'm going to try either this green mica powder or this dark ocean green mica powder. I think the dark ocean green might be a little bit too blue, but I might give it a shot and see what happens. Now that should use about half of the epoxy that I will have mixed up. Then I'm going to go and experiment with the white dye by itself. I'm going to mix that straight into the epoxy, pour one piece. Then I'm going to mix the white dye with the white mica powder and see if that gives me a more opaque appearance. And then I'm going to sprinkle in some of this gold mica powder, which really looks pretty awesome, and see what that effect looks like. My experiments for this run, these top 2 here are the clear epoxy. That top left one is just the dye placed on the epoxy, and I wanted to see how it would diffuse. This is a green and a black dye with a little bit of agitation. These two are powders. One's a heavier powder than the other. I didn't know if they would diffuse or just float or sink to the bottom. So a little bit different there. This is another different type of green where again I put a little bit of agitation up top. Here I've got some dirty pours. This was done with clear and a green mica powder. The dirty pour was done in another container and then poured into these, and I think that really caused a little bit too uniform of a mix than what I was going for. You can't see the bottom too well, but I made the white dye with powder and then added the gold glitter. And the gold glitter kind of made the white just look dirty, at least from here. But then what I decided to do was just go ahead and throw some of that white gold epoxy down on the bottom and then put the green on top. See how it worked. And then these two are actually the gold white mix and the green poured at the same time, side by side. So I'm kind of thinking that the colors will kind of fight each other a little bit, but still stay somewhat separate.